Welcome to How to Yu-Gi-Oh!
Historic Archetype, Monarch.
Chapter 1.
And let's get to it. So in this video, I'm going to be talking about monarchs and the historic value they've had for Yu-Gi-Oh! With that being said, let's get on with the rest of the video.
Chapter 2.
Here we are. Let's start with monarchs. To understand monarchs is to understand that monarchs are the first competitive anti-meta deck in Yu-Gi-Oh! History. Now, you look at me, fellow students, and say, what do you mean by this? Weren't there other anti-meta decks? Well, yes, they were. But when I say the first anti-meta, what I mean is a cohesive strategy for anti-meta at the time. Because you have to consider is that anti-meta did exist in Yu-Gi-Oh!, but they were all just gimmicks or just ways of doing things with a series of cards. There was no archetype, there was no strategy involved for anti-meta at the time.
Facts.
Yeah, there was, burn FTKs or stuff. I think burn FTKs were the only thing that were there at this point by the time Monarchs was released. And even when Monarchs was released at this point, they were just a series of cards. It wasn't something you could really put together. Sure, there was the Frog Monarchs that was there at the time, but again, Frog Monarchs was very, very gimmicky, and it was sort of consistent. But Monarchs, with the Monarch structure deck, this was the first time we had a competitive structure deck, might I add, and also a competitive anti-meta deck in Yu-Gi-Oh! At this point. Being the first of its kind, and being ahead of its time with how it just, when you summoned a Monarch monster with the field spell Domain of the True Monarchs, your opponent couldn't special summon anything from the extra deck is huge.
You don't get to play, you just lose.
Massive even, and is something that needs to be considered and taken into consideration, right? Yes, completely ahead of its time, and especially with the quick play spell, the Monarch Stormforth in that structure deck. Indeed, a lot at this time, Monarchs were going for quite a high price. So what is it? What is it about Monarchs that just changed Yu-Gi-Oh! Forever? Well, Monarchs did change Yu-Gi-Oh! They changed the anti-meta competitive scene. Before this point, anti-meta in Yu-Gi-Oh! Was fairly just gimmicky. There was no general strategy to it, and it was just a series of cards that players didn't like to play against, right? There was generally, while there were strategies and there were like obviously those repeat offenders that were cards which definitely you would auto lose on the spot. There was no consistent way to get these cards. You have to remember this time we didn't have searchers, Pot of Prosperity didn't exist. Was Pot of Duality even in the game? I think so. Might have been limited. So the ways to search traps and the ways to search all these things were just not accessible to us as players, right? It just wasn't there. And so when Monarchs came about and showcased to us a strategy of locking your opponent out of special summoning from the extra deck, that was huge. With consistency cards as well to boot, it was a fairly unfair gameplay. This was the first time, anyways, in Yu-Gi-Oh! History that we had a strategy promoted by Konami at this point in time that was unfair to play.
That's too strong.
Now, was it unbeatable? Absolutely not. If you had Mystical Space Typhoon or things or back row removal, you could destroy the field spell and thus allow you to play on. The problem is at the time some of the best back row removal was limited at this time, so it was severely difficult to get rid of Domain of the True Monarchs. Unlike how the game is now, back then back row removal was highly valued, highly sought after, and so they were limited on the ban list at that time. Yes, sirree. Yes, that was the way of Yu-Gi-Oh! At this point. So let's go over to the next slide to hammer home that point. And so we have Aether, the Heavenly Monarch. Indeed, this was one of the boss monsters that was in the structure deck at the time, and it was severely powerful. Not only did it allow you to have an additional summon, there was just, and sending 2 Monarch spell or traps, there was just loads of strategies and loads of things that you could do with this card. Again, this is the first time, I must add, that we had a cohesive strategy in an anti-meta scene, and definitely wouldn't be the last. But Monarchs are here to stay, and Monarchs are an example of how anti-meta can be done right when it is constructed efficiently. Okay? That's what it's all about. And I think that's all I've got to say about Monarchs. Not really much here, but that's it.
Final chapter.
And so we come to the conclusion. And so what do I got to conclude when it comes to Monarchs? Well, when it comes to Monarchs, Monarchs are the first competitive anti-meta strategy in Yu-Gi-Oh! History. Being the first, they were the roadmap to how Konami would create other anti-meta strategies in the future. And they tend to follow the Monarch blueprint, for sure. Whether it was True Draco that comes out in the future, or Subterra as well, which we'll talk about in a later historic archetype video and how that influenced Yu-Gi-Oh! But yeah, Monarchs is an archetype that influenced Yu-Gi-Oh! With anti-meta scene. It was the first time that we saw a strategy utilizing a field spell in Yu-Gi-Oh! At this point. While field spells at this point you have to consider were usually gimmicky and didn't really have any form of strategy. But this was the first time a field spell was given such sort of relevance and such sort of importance in Yu-Gi-Oh! And would definitely be a gimmick that we would see improved and expanded upon in future sets and in future years as Yu-Gi-Oh! Went by.
That sounds oddly familiar.
So yeah, Monarchs is an archetype that introduced a lot of things into Yu-Gi-Oh! First of all, introduced consistency. It introduced consistency, first of all, field spell usage to Yu-Gi-Oh! In a new and innovative way, and expanded upon this, and also introduced the way to use unfair cards to unleash unfair gameplay. While yes, we did have unfair cards in Yu-Gi-Oh!, but the consistent combos and ways that Monarchs showcased on how to use unfair strategies and combos to the opponent was an eye-opening experience for anyone who was a fan of anti-meta strategies. And it was the start of anti-meta gaining the tools and equipment they needed to compete in the competitive scene. And so we must always remember where anti-meta has come from, where it festers, and how it got its fangs, and why it is so dangerous today. It is because of the tribulations and the pioneering of Monarchs that anti-meta is as dangerous and as powerful as it is today. Remember this is where it came from. Well, with that being said, that's all I've got to say in this video. Tune in next time as we'll talk about other things on my channel. Hope to see you soon.
We come to the end of this video. So, as I like to say, you are one step closer to becoming a Yu-Gi-Oh! Master. My fate, right, is in your hands.